Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the That One Dude for Week 8. We're going to be looking, normally it's position by position every single week. This week we're going to scrap quarterback because there's not that much leverage at the quarterback position. Last week we had some with Tua in this video. He ended up popping off for his best career game ever for fantasy, and he got steamed throughout the weekend a little bit. He was still somewhat lower owned, single entry, high stakes, and more ownership than you would like, but not too much is showing up this week. It's kind of the studs, those players that we talked about in the top stacks video, the first edition dropping this week. Those quarterbacks are really where I'm going, and all those guys are picking up ownership above 5%, you know, anywhere from 8 to 10% for the most part. So we're going to be looking at a running back, 3 receivers, and a tight end that all look like very good plays and all happen to come in at 5% or below ownership on this slate. So they're That One Dudes for Week 8. Let's start it off with a wide receiver. Here you go. Ready? There's a subscribe button if you want to tap that. I appreciate that. Double check to make sure you are subscribed. And let's roll into it with the first wide receiver we were talking about this week. Now, this wide receiver finds himself in the 6K range, which we have not seen in a decent amount of time. Normally a $7,000 wide receiver. He's been on some showdown slates each of the past 2 weeks, so we haven't gotten to play him on the main slate, and he's without his quarterback. It's kind of vague, but without the quarterback might give it away a little bit. He's a Seattle Seahawks player, and his name is DK Metcalf, who continues to produce, albeit though not on a consistency basis that you can see happening for the rest of the season if Geno Smith had to remain in there, but continues to produce with Geno Smith. I currently have at $6,800 DK Metcalf for 15.8 fantasy points, coming in at 5% ownership. Now, for his price point and that projection, yeah, he doesn't look like a good play relative to players around him. But when you start to factor in his ceiling, which is clearly in the 20s to 30s, and also his lower ownership at 5%, and the fact that he is the #1 player in the NFL right now in terms of size and speed comparisons at 230 pounds, and he's maybe going to be in this game the fastest player on the field. When you factor in his weight, he is the fastest player per weight in the NFL. Yes, faster than Tyreek Hill. When you factor that in, which is crazy, right? That advantage is always going to provide upside. Like you saw last week, it wasn't a great game on the showdown slate for him, but he catches an 80+ yard touchdown because he's just a monster. So there's that extra gear to him. So with these 2.5 games that Geno Smith has played, you've gotten the 27-point game where you had Russell Wilson in there for the first half. Then you got a 12-point game versus the Steelers, which was definitely a tough matchup. And then you follow it back up in a bad weather game in another tough matchup against a Saints defense where you have a top corner and Marshawn Lattimore out there, and he scores 18 points again on that limited 2 receptions, the big play. But now it's a totally different script here. Now it's Jacksonville, where there's nothing out there. Like you're going to be getting Nevin Lawson trying to guard him in Jacksonville. They have nothing left in Jacksonville, right? At all on that entire defense. They trade away CJ Henderson, the second-year player, top 10 pick for them just last year. They trade him away earlier in the season. There's just not much on the bone. So you're getting DK Metcalf with a nice team total, 24 implied team total. So they're expected to score points in this one, which should be a better environment game in terms of weather. And he's coming in at low ownership, and he's clearly the main guy so far. And the connection is there between Geno and DK Metcalf, and he's playing the same game. Like this offense is playing pretty similar. In the 2 starts that Geno has had, 28 and 23 routes run for DK Metcalf. I mean, you look at his starts with Russell Wilson this year, it's 28, it's 29, it's 25, it's 28 routes run, right? So they're playing the same. They're trying to rely on the run. They got somewhat of a mobile quarterback, and they're mainly throwing it to Lockett and Metcalf, and for the most part, Metcalf is the true X receiver out there. So in terms of performances so far this season, you have yet to see Metcalf score less than 11 fantasy points. Basically, on average right now, he's scoring around 16 to 7 fantasy points per game, and there's that obvious ceiling into the 24 to 30+ point range if he hits the 100-yard bonus or finds the end zone. So I like Metcalf, and just for comparison reasons, these tweets, they go up on Twitter. They get a lot of good feedback, so at DFS if you want to check them out. This is what I have. I have DK Metcalf for 6,800, 15.8 fantasy points, and 5% projected ownership. Where are those numbers coming from? My projections on Patreon. There's over 1,000 members. You can come join the community. There's this type of information and a lot more projections, ranks, optimizer now, Discord access, ownership projections. Not only for NFL, but NBA, MMA, PGA, MLB, as that's going to continue for a couple more days. So you can check it all out. Come join the community down below. But DK Metcalf, compare it to another freak who popped off last week, right? His first big game of the year or best game of the year, and A.J. Brown, another freak who is this size speed monster. 16.2 fantasy points, so basically the exact same projection. A.J. Brown is actually more expensive, and as of this recording, A.J. Brown is coming in with 13% ownership, more than double the ownership as DK Metcalf. That is improper. That is incorrect. That is what you see here in terms of the big game last week for A.J. Brown, right? So he's more recently getting you there on the main slate for a lot of people. And the fact that people are worried about Geno Smith. These last two matchups are totally different than what DK Metcalf is getting this time. Give me DK Metcalf at that ownership number. And right now I'm going to slide up from Prize Picks. They have not yet released the receiving numbers for DK Metcalf. If it's somewhere in the 50s or 60s, I want that number over all day, so be sure to check there. But the fantasy points, over 14 fantasy points. I just told you I have them for 15.8. So I like the over fantasy points on Prize Picks. If you use the code SAL, you get a free bet up to $100 on your first bet. So be sure to check it out. They have player props, right? Player props, but also the reason I like them is they have a lot of fantasy props like you see right here. And since I project fantasy points, we're going to be having a nice edge. I take the over 14 fantasy points on DK Metcalf. Again, that code SAL. Take advantage of it right now. Limited time offer. Might end by the end of the month, which is right now. Use the code SAL, FREE. Free bet up to $100 on Prize Picks, Metcalf over 14. We transition now to the second player. Let's talk about a running back here who a lot of the times maybe we're finding some mid-range value, some cheap value. These are some guys that, yeah, they're in the 6K range. The exact same price point as DK Metcalf, $6,800. You find another low-owned player at the running back position. Very low-owned right now. Now, maybe part of it is just the fact that he's been banged up and injured and people don't know the status yet, but also another part of it is there's just a lot of pass-catching running backs in his price range. You have guys like Darrell Henderson, who is seeing a lot of work and some passing game work. You have James Robinson. You have DeAndre Swift. You have Joe Mixon. These guys are flashier names. They've been out there more recently. They've been succeeding for you all year long between James Robinson, Henderson, and DeAndre Swift. So Nick Chubb right now is going massively underowned. $6,800 Nick Chubb. I have him for 15.8 fantasy points. The same price and the same projection. It just worked out that way as DK Metcalf at 3% ownership. That is unreal, especially when you factor in there's no Kareem Hunt out there. Hunt is going to be out. Nick Chubb is returning this week, and D'Ernest Johnson has been named the backup running back. D'Ernest Johnson looked great on Thursday Night Football. He is not the same caliber of athlete as talent, especially in the receiving game, as Kareem Hunt. So Nick Chubb's target share opportunity can potentially rise here. His overall touch count is likely going to rise here. The odds that he is going to be taken out for D'Ernest Johnson in the red zone becomes less than if it was Kareem Hunt. So overall, the role for Chubb becomes way more secure, and you might now see 3 or 4 targets or 2 or 3 receptions instead of 0 to 1, which continues to just raise a floor and a ceiling for him. He's less than $7,000. He's arguably debated as the best pure runner in football, and he's coming in at 3% projected ownership with clear and obvious touchdown upside with an increase to his potential pass catching role. Now let's look at some comparisons on here. You get Jonathan Taylor, who's been popping off lately, but Jonathan Taylor, similar role as Nick Chubb, right? These guys are often compared as maybe 2 of the best pure runners in football. Similar situations in terms of how their offenses want to succeed, in terms of how much targets they see. Jonathan Taylor, I have him for less fantasy points. He's more expensive, as you can see on the tweet right here, 15.2 fantasy points, so a half a point less than Chubb, and he's coming in with more than double the ownership at 8% projected ownership. Another player that I actually like in a vacuum more than Nick Chubb, but when you factor in the ownership, I start to lean to Chubb in GPPs. Darrell Henderson is slightly cheaper than Chubb at $6,500. He's projecting out for 1 more point at 16.8 fantasy points. He's in a similarly good matchup here as double-digit home favorites, going to get a lot of touches, but he's 18% owned right now. He is 6 times as owned as Nick Chubb for 1 more fantasy point in projection and similar ceilings, right? Nick Chubb, for me, at $6,800, I expect this ownership to maybe rise. Maybe it gets up to 6 or 8%, but even then it's going to be too low. Now, as of right now, I don't see any bets out there. I think they're probably waiting to see what the news is as the week goes on, but he's expected fully to play. But on Underdog and on Prize Picks, I'm not currently seeing anything, but be sure to check Underdog and Prize Picks, both of them. You get a free bet up to $100 if you use the code SAL on either of them. Shop your lines on both sites. They're both player prop sites. Check them for the over rushing yards. I also want to see what the receptions are at. If they lay a half or a 1.5 receptions number on Chubb without Kareem Hunt, I'm taking the over there. I want to see what the rushing yards are like. If this rushing yards comes in the 60s or even low 70s, we smash even mid to high 70s. I mean, I think I have him right now for 88 rushing yards. So we like that a lot. If we get anything below that, the over. So there is a wide receiver who's a stud in the 6K range and underowned, and a running back who is one of the massive studs in the league as a running back in the 6K range and going to be underowned on this 12-game slate. Let's transition back now to another $6,000 mid-range wide receiver this week. Now, this wide receiver has another wide receiver in his receiving core returning after missing every single week outside of getting hurt in week 1. We go to Denver, where Teddy Bridgewater's wide receiver, Courtland Sutton, is $6,400 this week, and he is another that one dude option because a 15.4 fantasy point projection. Solid projection for the price point. Coming in at 2% owned. Okay, well, there's got to be better options around him. There is. At the exact same price point, the same price syndrome that I talk about in my daily fantasy sports course, which if you're interested, there's a daily fantasy sports course I have linked down below. It's about 10 plus hours of videos on game theory, on how to play, on how to build models and all this other stuff, how to take into account ownership, leverage, and all that, same price theory, all these types of things. You can check it out down below, but the same price theory just says that When players are the same price, one of them is naturally going to suck up all of the ownership. One of them, the entire market will just say is the better play at that price point. And it's pretty obvious this week that without Antonio Brown, and also maybe a limited Rob Gronkowski, who is practicing, but without Antonio Brown, that $6,400 Chris Godwin, who just popped off for 100 yards, who was highly owned last week and paid off for everybody, is going to come in as the better play. Look, he is the same price and he projects out for more fantasy points. It's a better offense. It's a better quarterback. They pass the ball a shit ton and run a lot of plays in Tampa. It's obvious. 16.8 fantasy points. Chris Godwin is the better play than Courtland Sutton if you're talking about projection. He's going to be the better play if you're talking about building a stack. But if you're looking at one-off options here and trying to get different, Chris Godwin is coming in with 15% ownership to Courtland Sutton's 2%, and he's only projecting out for one more point, right? One more point. Obviously, Jerry Jeudy's coming back, so maybe that takes away some of the target share. But Courtland Sutton, we've seen it multiple times this year. His ceiling is 30-plus point games, right? 30-plus point games that Teddy Bridgewater has been able to sustain for him. So there's a chance here that this is going to be a massive leverage opportunity, not only off of Chris Godwin, but you can see my tweet on the screen about Robert Woods. Robert Woods right now, yes, he has the better quarterback. Yes, he's in the better offense. Again, he's $100 cheaper. Similar point projection here at 16 fantasy points, coming in at 10% ownership, 5 times the ownership. And a lot of this is because these players are going to be tied into the Tampa Bay and Rams stacks, and I understand that, but if you're just talking about leverage in general, you're going to find it here. I mean, you continue to see Courtland Sutton see volume. Courtland Sutton has seen 8, 11, 14, and 5 targets in his last few games. And in those games, he's had 8, 25, 23, and 12 fantasy points. And if you factor in the DraftKings over 100 yards bonus, there's a 28-point game in there. There's a 29-point game in there. He's had these big weeks. Now, some weeks it disappears. That's what's going to happen with Teddy Bridgewater in this offense. But in 3 of his 7 games, he now has over 25 fantasy points, so we know that there is a ceiling there, especially when you compare it to Robert Woods or Chris Godwin. Similar players. They have similar ceilings, all these guys, but one of them is going to come in massively lower owned. So I look at this right now, and I see that over on Underdog, we have a player prop of 66.5 receiving yards for Courtland Sutton. Now, that is a really good number. It's a number that I'm a little bit even hesitant to go to. So far, we've seen Courtland Sutton go over that number, though, in 4 out of his 7 games. And he could have gone over it in 5 out of his 7 games in week 3 against the Jets, where he only had 37 receiving yards, but he had 2 receptions called back. 2 receptions called back for holding and things like that, he would have gone over it. So Courtland Sutton, I right now take the over 66.5, as you can see right here on Underdog Fantasy. So again, these are just player prop sites. You should shop your odds versus Underdog and Prize Picks, whichever one has the best odds for you. Right now, Prize Picks does not have a number on Sutton, so I want to get this number out early in the week. Over 66.5 on Courtland Sutton. The code SAL gets you a free bet up to $100. Take advantage of this. Open up the earballs, right? Free. Literally a free bet up to $100. Check that out. The over 66.5 on Courtland Sutton. So we got 3 players through, and the like button will pop up somewhere here if you want to tap that bad boy right now. And also, we're going to have a 1% flyer play right now, and then the tight end play this week that I think is a nice low-owned leverage. Let's start with the 1% owned flyer play. 1% owned flyer plays can be tough. Usually, you're not going to find it at the running back. The tight ends, you don't want to play those guys at 1% owned. They're just touchdown or bust guys. Quarterbacks, you don't want to play the 1% owned Zach Wilsons or those types of Justin Fields terrible plays. So it's normally going to be wide receivers. There's just more of them, more options. And I do think we have a decent option here. TRE QUAN SMITH returned last week for the New Orleans Saints, right? And he did not play that great. And just in general, I mean, nobody on that team really did unless you're Alvin Kamara. So now they get a matchup, though, against the pass funnel of Tampa Bay. So TRE QUAN SMITH's going to come in here at $3,900. I've been projecting out for 8.6 fantasy points at 1% projected ownership. This is going to be a very low-owned run back option. So if you want to play Tampa Bay backs and probably obviously going to stack it, run it back with Alvin Kamara, you could also or run it back with TRE QUAN SMITH, who will be very low-owned. TRE QUAN SMITH only averages like 7.5 fantasy points per game in his NFL career. Last week, he played 55% of the snaps, mainly out of the slot, ran 24 routes, caught 1 ball for 11 yards, 2 fantasy points on those 24 routes, and 3 targets. So that's not great. But now that he's healthy again, maybe gets up to 66% of the snaps. They're trailing in this game by a lot, potentially, as underdogs facing Tampa Bay in this funnel, and you might see him run 30 routes. You might see him see 5 or 6 targets. The whole point here is that this is a player you can get into mainly your Tampa Bay run back stacks, right? Get a little bit of exposure to him because he's cheap. He is the exact same price as Van Jefferson. You can see my tweet here. Van Jefferson is projecting out for basically the same fantasy points. 9.2 fantasy points, but 5 times his owned. The only way I'm playing Van Jefferson this week is in my stacks with the Rams. Just like we did last week, he finds the end zone. But the same thing should be true here. The only way you're probably playing TRE QUAN SMITH is in your run back options in the stacks with Tampa Bay, yet not as many people are going to him, even though, yes, Van Jefferson is targeted more downfield. He's going to be in the better offense. I understand all of that. But at the end of the day, their projections look similar. They're basically both going to get you there on a touchdown or 3 or 4 receptions, but nobody wants to play TRE QUAN SMITH here. So I do think that you should be adding TRE QUAN SMITH to your run back options of Tampa Bay stacks. I do think that he is a very solid low-owned option in those stacks to not only give you salary relief, relief off of a expensive Tom Brady, expensive Mike Evans, a decent priced Chris Godwin, expensive Kamara. Like, that's an expensive stack. This is a way to kind of give yourself a little bit of price salary relief, if you will. I do like that. I took his over 8 fantasy points. I have him barely over 8 fantasy points at 8.6. I took the over 8 fantasy points, especially because I think they're going to be having to play from behind. Jameis, you're starting to see very slowly throw more 30 and 35 times in his last 2 games. And if he has to start to open it up downfield, as Michael Thomas is still not going to be back, there's a chance that TRE QUAN SMITH can actually be the leading target getter, even ahead of Kamara, if they start throwing downfield a little bit more in this offense. You've gotten 30 and 35 attempts from Jameis each of these past 2 weeks, which is something you had not seen all season long, as before that, his previous high was 23. He's seen his attempts go up in each of the past 4 weeks. They should probably hit a new season high this week, maybe close to 40, now that they're facing Tampa Bay. So that over 8.5 fantasy points is on Prize Picks. I have not yet seen any receptions or receiving. I would like to take the over. If there's an over 2 receptions, if they throw that number out there, even over 2.5, I'd be tempted to take on TRE QUAN SMITH. I want to see what the yards are like. If it's anywhere in the 20s or 30s, I definitely want that number on TRE QUAN SMITH, but you can get that on Prize Picks. Again, that code SAL. Free bet up to $100. The over 8, you can pair some of these together as well if you want to. So check it all out down below. And then for the final that one, dude, it was going to actually end up being Dawson Knox, but he's already been ruled out for the week. So there's really not that much leverage at the tight end position. There's a lot more leverage at wide receivers. You can check the tools on Patreon, the leverage between projection and ownership and all that type of stuff, where the letter grades are in terms of just figuring out where the best leverage is if you need more. But at tight end, there's not that much leverage. Like Dan Arnold is a punt play. I'll just play him. He's going to be low owned. He's going to be decent owned, but still like 6-7%. And then you have other ways to mix and match depending on where your stacks are going. So I'm really just trying to get guys in my stack. So if Gronk's end up playing, we'll get him in those stacks with Tampa Bay. If it's Tyler Higbee, he'll have some ownership, but we'll get him in the stacks with the Rams. The Bills, though, is interesting. Like, I wanted it to be Dawson Knox. He's at a price point where it was going to keep him low owned, and his production not coming too much because of the hand injury, and he's already been ruled out. Tommy Sweeney's an interesting name to look at. He scored the touchdown in the last game. He only ran 3 routes. I don't know how much he's going to be used, but it looks like he is the next man up in Buffalo. I do think it more so just helps Cole Beasley secure the middle of the field a lot more, and we already like him at relatively low ownership. So in terms of a leverage play at tight end this week, you can go to Tommy Sweeney. You could add him into your Buffalo stacks, definitely, and it's 2,900, so he gets you a little bit of price relief there. Only going to project out for like 4 to 6 fantasy points. Obviously, probably more so a touchdown or bust player. Nowhere near the same type of athlete or downfield usage player as a Dawson Knox. So if we had to choose a tight end in terms of that one dude, it would be Tommy Sweeney, just putting it in mainly only in your Buffalo stacks. Otherwise, just punt with Dan Arnold elsewhere. Dan Arnold either way looks like the better play, even if you just wanted to put him in Buffalo stacks. Have Cole Beasley, Diggs with Allen. Run it back if you want to. You don't have to. And just put a Dan Arnold in there instead. That makes sense. But if you wanted somebody, Tommy Sweeney is at least an appealing name to try and find some leverage on a 1% owned $2,900 tight end this week. But there you go. There's a that one dudes overall. There's 3 receivers. There's a 1% owned flyer play. There's a random tight end at the end of it all. Too bad Dawson Knox already been ruled out. Get that hand all healed up. How you doing? And then, Nick Chubb, right? The stud running back. So there you go. It's all been said. Be sure to use the code SAL on Prize Picks or Underdog. Compare your odds on both sites, right? Over-unders. Use the code SAL for a free bet, limited time offer. Simple, free. SAL, you go to Underdog, you go to Prize Picks, you type in your information, you make an account, you have a promo code, yes, SAL, your free bet up to $100. Take advantage of it. It's pretty ridiculous if you got 2 seconds not to. I appreciate you all tuning in, so thank you. We will have the Closing Thoughts show tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Eastern time, so be sure to bring all your questions for that one. If you want to get all the tools that we offer, some of the ones in here, the leverage, right, the ownership versus projections, the Discord, the optimizers for a bunch of different sports, projections, all that, check it out on Patreon. We got over 1,000 members. Come join the community. I'll see you when I see you. I'll see you in the next one, gang. Enjoy the rest of your day.